Hello and welcome to The Messy Middle. My name's Laura Cook, and this episode I am so grateful to have Dr. Melissa H. Smith on the show to talk about trust. Dr. Melissa Smith is a licensed psychologist, leadership coach, certified Dare to Lead facilitator, and certified eating disorder specialist. She is an entrepreneur, business leader, and student of life. As the CEO of Balance Health and Healing, she leads a team of talented professionals who provide specialized psychological services dedicated to meeting the unique needs of women. As a leadership coach, Dr. Smith works with high-achieving leaders, executive teams, and organizations wishing to banish blocks, cultivate growth, and lead with courage. Dr. Smith is the host of Pursue What Matters, a podcast dedicated to helping individuals thrive in love and work. She earned her doctoral degree at the APA accredited counseling psychology program at Brigham Young University, which included an APA accredited pre-doctoral internship at the University of Michigan. Dr. Smith also holds a master's degree in counseling from Truman State University in Kirksville and an MBA degree from the University of Utah. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be with you.
I'm so glad that we're talking about trust, especially, when we think about remote work environments and the process of returning to work one day. Trust is so important. Why do you think the concept of trust is important in the workplace?
To your point, this year of COVID has taught us a lot about how to work effectively and how important our teams are at work. And so I think we've all learned some maybe painful, but also important lessons about the value of trust. In a word, trust really allows us to thrive at work. And the result of being able to thrive is that we get to do our best work and we get to contribute at a higher level. And so that's really, why trust is so incredibly important at work. Trust is a core component of psychological safety. I'm an Idaho farm girl, so I'm down in the United States and work in Utah, but grew up in Idaho. And I come from a long line of potato and grain farmers. And so when I think about psychological safety, I think about it as the fertile ground that allows a solid foundation for the organization, the team, its members, and everyone they serve to really thrive and be successful. And so there are some really profound findings around psychological safety. There's higher profitability, which most leaders really like hearing. There's a stronger organizational culture. So psychological safety is really the foundation of a strong organizational culture. Individuals and teams are able to accomplish their largest goals, their stretch goals, and expand the ways that they can serve their audience and their stakeholders. Psychological safety is so important. And the way that I think about trust with that, it's one of the most important nutrients in that fertile soil, in that it's part of what makes it fertile and helps a team to really grow to their success and to their potential. And so when we think about kind of the two findings that are so essential in building psychological safety and trust at work is team members really are aware of one another. They care about what's happening. They're sensitive to the needs of one another. And then the second finding, and I think this one kind of surprises people sometimes, but when you think practically about it, it makes perfect sense. Team members speak in roughly the same proportion. So no one's dominating in a team meeting or in a conversation. And so those two are really the most important factors when we think about building psychological safety and certainly trust at work. The other thing, when I think of why is it so important at work, I would just say consider your own experience with trust in your life, right? I mean, think about your most important relationships. And for all of us, I think it becomes a no-brainer that the fact that trust is so incredibly important. So what I would say about that is understand that your work relationships are no different. We don't have a work self that is set off and cut off from the rest of our lives, especially if we think about this last year. If you stop and think about how much trust is actually required at work. Most of us are working on teams. So, in a very real way, like your livelihood
Mhm.
and your success, your opportunities for advancement absolutely hinges on the work of others, in a very real way, right? If you can't trust the guy in the cubicle across from you to get his part of the project done well and on time, that will really impede your ability to be successful at work. And, I think the other component of that, so we think about the content of the work, and then we think about the process of the work. If you're worried that others are talking about you behind your back or they're criticizing your work, but they're not having a conversation with you about it directly,
Mhm.
then you spend some of your valuable time and energy at work worrying.
Mhm.
And it cuts down collaboration and creativity because you're actually not freed up to do your most important work, right? Like you're worried about what's happening under the surface with the people you're working with. And so it's so important. I'm kind of a zealot about it, as you can tell.
Well, I'm sold. And I just did an episode on shame and talking about how shame is like really being disconnected from others. And I think when I think about trust in my experience in the workplace, when I maybe trust was absent, it was also a time where I felt so disconnected. And
Yeah,
so I think trust is such an important connector, don't you?
yeah, absolutely.
So let's look at the flip side of that. What
Yeah.
happens when trust is lost? What are some of the signposts?
Yeah. So I love that you use the word signpost because that is actually kind of the language that I use. We're all on a journey, right? So whether that's a leadership journey, whether that is, a journey towards a big goal or kind of that career path. And, we have things along our path that help us, and we have things along our path that may hurt us. And so if we think about some of the signposts, right? Like these are some of the signs that can kind of help us know, like, hey, you might be headed in the wrong direction, or, there's something, at the very least, there's something here to pay attention to. And so, what happens when trust is lost? First of all, teams go into survival mode. So, at the beginning, my first response was that trust helps teams thrive. And
Mm,
when there is an absence of trust, we are not able to thrive. We actually go into survival mode. And if you think about what survival mode looks like for us, right? Like whether it's in the animal kingdom or whether it's for us, we're scanning the horizon to really watch for the closest exit sign because we're like, this doesn't feel good. I don't know if I'm safe here, whether that is physically safe, whether that is psychologically safe. And so, what that looks like on your teams and in your organization is less communication,
mm,
less collaboration, less productive fighting. And it's really important. Healthy teams actually fight, they disagree, they have a devil's advocate. And so you have, right, sometimes, and this can kind of surprise people, when you have less trust on a team, you may have what appears to be more consensus. And it's typically not consensus. It's that people are silencing themselves
mhm,
because they don't feel safe or they've been silenced by others. And so they're like, I've been bit once. I'm not going back in. And so there's less productive fighting, fewer opinions, lower creativity, right? Because when we're in survival mode, our energy and our focus is going to what do I have to do to make it through this day?
mhm,
You don't have the ability to actually consider new ideas and new ways of thinking. So those are some of the things we have less of. So less communication, collaboration, productive fighting, fewer opinions, lower creativity. Now let's think about what we have more of. So we have more anxiety, we have more depression, we have more hopelessness, we have higher turnover. That is definitely one of the big, large signposts that we would pay attention to. You have higher rates of absenteeism, right?
mm,
People calling in sick, people just not showing up. And what happens eventually with the higher turnover is people leave for safer ground
mm.
because it's just too stressful to stay in that situation where there's not trust. So it has a huge impact on organizations and teams.
Yeah. Thank you so much for calling that out. And again, in a past episode, we were talking about resilience, but one of the things that we explored was how nice on the surface is typically hiding some kind of fear. And so I like that you kind of called it out that if a team is all appearing to be in agreement and fairly silent and appearing nice, quote unquote nice, it could be covering something up that's going on under the surface.
Yeah, and I mean, I think about that and I talk about that with the teams and the leaders that I work with, especially as they're considering hiring decisions, is don't hire for culture fit, which I think
Mhm.
is what most of us have been taught. And that's kind of our natural tendency because we like to be with people who share our opinions. We like to be with people who see things the same way we do. At the surface level, it feels like, well, this is going to be more productive and this is going to be more helpful. Like we're all agreeing, we're all on the same page. But that actually can be disastrous for teams. And so, what I always tell people is hire for culture add. Who do we have on our team? What are our skill sets? Even like temperamental, like that's something, as a psychologist, I really pay attention to. But then you ask, so you kind of assess your team and then you ask, who could strengthen us? What
Mm.
are the skills that we lack? Where are our blind spots? And I think that's a really important piece, especially if you're knowledge workers, but certainly in any industry. And so if you hire for culture fit, initially you're going to have more trust, but eventually there will be less psychological safety because you're not challenging one another. You're not actually going through the due diligence of getting to better decisions. And so some healthy disagreement,
Mm.
and this is actually what builds trust, is having some rules of engagement, right? Have knowing that we can argue and we can disagree and we can have really rigorous conversations. That trust is actually, and psychological safety is actually what makes that doable. It's what
Mhm.
helps us to grow because we know that there are some ground rules, right? We're going to be respectful. We will absolutely critique an idea because that's what you need to do to get to better decisions. But we never critique the person, right? We focus on specific concerns, specific complaints, which will always come up in the course of work because no one's perfect. And, getting projects done is hard work. But there's a big difference between focusing on concerns and valid complaints and having global critiques of other individuals, right? Like that obviously erodes trust and safety. And that's where people go silent on teams.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think innovation lacks as well when we're hiring for culture fit. So I love that concept of culture add. That's
Yeah.
such a great tool. So using your analogy of really providing nutrients to the soil, what can leaders do? I think you mentioned a few things in our conversation that we just had, but what can leaders do to build trust on their teams? What are some things they can do?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is hopefully what folks are doing now, which is understanding why it matters so much, right? Like not dismissing it, not saying like it's not that big of a deal, right? Like I trust my spouse at home, I don't need to trust the people I work with. And so I think, having buy-in and understanding why trust really matters. And I think what's true is so many leaders are very well intentioned, but they are focused in on the details of the work, which is very demanding and it really, calls for your attention. And there can be sometimes difficulty in taking that step back and looking at the big picture and looking at, right, like we're so focused on the content of what are we doing and what needs to get done that sometimes we fail to look at why does this matter
Hmm.
and how actually is the work unfolding. And so I think that's the first thing is understanding why trust really matters. I think another thing to remember and to keep in mind is that trust is earned in small moments. Many of us think that trust includes these grand gestures, and it really doesn't. I mean, it could, but actually, that's going to be a less stable foundation for connection. John Gottman, the incredible couples researcher, has done so much work around trust. And he talks about these sliding door moments. So these small moments in the course of a day, in the course of work, where we have opportunities to show up for one another. And when I say show up, I mean, listen, I mean, perspective of another person. It means sharing the floor in a team meeting. It means actually giving some time and some consideration to the opinion shared that you might really be very opposed to. And so all of that, like those are sliding door moments. And so do we build trust by listening, by showing up, by being attentive, and all of those things that build trust, or do we miss that sliding door moment? And do we close down our thinking, or do we just move on to our next item on the list? And those are really the most important moments where we build trust. The important point from John Gottman's discussion of these small moments is most of us on teams, we have good intent, right? Like we want to play nicely in the sandbox. We might have different agendas, we might have different priorities, but most of us have good intent. And in these sliding door moments, what Gottman teaches us is that usually the missed opportunities for connection and for trust building is not because of nefarious intent. It's not because we're out to get someone. It's because we're mindless. It's because we're not actually present in that moment. And so I think that understanding that can be really powerful because, first of all, a leader is the most important and powerful example of any principle in an organization. And so your abilities to slow it down, your ability to attend to the small moments and think about how often that shows up in a team meeting, right? Like even in the course of an hour team meeting, boy, noticing this person has not spoken a word in 40 minutes and getting curious about that. And so it really helps to increase that awareness. So a couple other things is I spent a lot of time in college. One of the things I really loved was this concept of office hours, right? So most professors would have office hours where students could stop by, they could ask questions, they could have conversations, they could have, an opportunity for kind of deeper exploration of a concern or a question or whatever. And I think that is a great recommendation for leaders. Have office hours. Sometimes another version of that is having an open door policy, but I actually like the concept of the office hours better because it's more structured and it really communicates, right? Like, hey, this is my valuable time as a leader and I want to give it to you, right? It also makes things a little more sane because if a leader always has an open door policy, they don't get anything done. So,
Right.
but that, those office hours really communicates that you care about the needs of those you lead. You also, don't have a Pollyanna view of the fact that, what, we're going to have concerns inevitably arise. If we can address those in our team meetings, that's awesome. But sometimes that's not reasonable and that's not effective. And so I think having those office hours really conveys and helps to build a culture of trust and openness and a willingness to understand. So I think that that's really powerful. And then the other thing, and this can also be a challenge for a lot of leaders, is we want to think about the ways that you guide your team. I think what we really want to focus on is letting them know what needs to happen. What do they need to do, right? Like, what is the task? What is the project? And really flesh that out, right? And that might not be the leader's job alone, of course. Most often it's not. But having clear processes, policies, expectations, metrics, right? KPIs for success, job description, project requirements, right? Like, do your job as the leader to really frame the work so that people have a clear understanding of what needs to happen and then get out of the way. We don't want micromanagement. And so I always think about like, let them know what needs to happen and be explicitly clear about that. But you let your team figure out how, right? Let them figure out how. How does the job get done? This is a huge confidence and trust builder on teams. I think this is also another little plug for the office hours, because you're also communicating, hey, I'm not leaving you alone in the desert. Like, I'm here to support you, but I have confidence that you're creative, you're smart, you're skilled. That's why you're in this role, and that you can figure out the details of how to do that work. And so I think it can be really helpful. And so the big message there is resist the tendency to micromanage, right? Like, be willing to delegate and let your team figure out the how.
Mhm.
And that leads to really powerful shifts in growth and productivity.
Yeah, so true.